Hello and welcome back to another episode of PEEPanEIP, a series dedicated to explore Ethereum improvement proposals, upcoming features, and understand its impact on the users and developers community. I'm Pooja Ranjan, and today we are going to talk one of the most discussed proposals of London Upgrade, EIP-1559. So if you're new to EIP-1559, it is highly recommended to watch episode 16 of PEEPanEIP before watching this episode. There we discuss this proposal in length with Tim Beiko. Link is available on the top right screen of your computer and also in the YouTube description box. Today, we are going to be talking in continuation to that, starting with a quick overview of EIP 1559, the timeline of London Upgrade. We'll try to understand what to expect post-launch. We have already received a lot of questions, so if time permits, presentations will be followed by the question and answer. With no more delay, let me introduce our guests, Tim Beiko, Barnabe, and Micah Zoltu. Micah and Tim, you have been our show earlier. Welcome again. If I may request you, for our new viewers, could you say a few words about yourself? And Barnabe, this is your first time, so we'd love to have an introduction, a little bit to know you more and your way to Ethereum community. Anyone can start.
Sure. My name is Tim Beiko. I run the Awkward Devs meetings, and over the past 2-ish years now, I've been working on 1559. Yeah.
My name is Micah Zoltu. I stick my nose in where it doesn't belong and get involved in projects despite people asking me not to. And that's how I got involved in 1559. And I'm just passionate about it and want to see it go through and succeed.
My name is Barnabe Monnot. It's my first time here, as Pooja said, so very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I work at the Ethereum Foundation in the Robust Incentive Group, which is a research unit dedicated to things that are a bit more economics, game theory, simulations inspired. So I made my way to 1559 to kind of check that everything is sound. And we'll get to talk a bit about that. Before that, I just joined the Ethereum community very organically, just joining hackathons, kind of meeting people through friends of friends, and very happy to be here.
Thank you so much for introduction. So I believe we have a couple of presentations to be shared today. Without any more delay, let's begin.
Sure. Okay, do you see my slides here? Okay, so this is a repurposed presentation for the cat herders, kind of the updated version of something I did earlier this year. So basically, I'll start just giving kind of an overview of what 1559 is, kind of the timelines to launch it, and then I'll hand it over to Barnabe to discuss what to look for after 1559 is live. So at a high level, 1559, it's an EIP. Vitalik put it forward in 2019. Fun fact, there were like some discussions and blog posts about it as early as 2016. So it really took a while to kind of get formalized into this EIP. And it really has like 3 main goals. The first is to make transaction fees more predictable. The second is to reduce the inclusion delay for transactions when they get sent to the network. And the third is that it creates a positive feedback loop between network usage and the Ethereum Ether supply. And at a very high level, how it achieves this is that in order to make transaction fees more predictable, it allows users to specify, it specifies in the protocol the minimum fee, which we call the base fee, that a transaction needs to pay to be included. So we go from a system where figuring out what you need to pay to be included in a block is kind of implicit and it's not part of the protocol itself, to a system where every block header tells you basically this is the minimum fee you need to pay. And then the way it goes about reducing the inclusion delays is that it doubles the block size compared to what we have today and aims to keep blocks half empty most of the time, which means that on average, when a new transaction comes in, there's basically half the block that's empty in order to accommodate it. So that means that transactions can be included much quicker. And the way it creates this positive feedback loop between the network usage and the ETH supply is that as more and more people want to use the network, it'll increase this minimum fee you need to pay called the base fee. And this part of the fee is burnt. So that means that more people wanting to use the Ethereum network leads to a base fee being higher and therefore an increased deflationary pressure on the supply. So this was very high level. I'll try to give a more detailed explanation of these three things. So if we start, just looking at how can we actually do these variable size blocks that let us fit in more transactions, it's basically by saying that when 1559 happens, we will double the block size and aim to keep blocks half full. If we see that blocks start to be more than half full, so there's more than 50% gas used, we simply raise the minimum fee. And by raising this fee, we kind of reduce the demand for transacting at that price. So the blocks should converge again to a spot where they're half full. And similarly, if we see that blocks are not being half full, so there's not 50% of the gas used, then we could just lower the minimum fee and kind of induce demand for transactions on the network. One of kind of the questions people have about this is, well, if we could do this, why don't we just do it today, or why don't we just double the blocks all the time, and we'll be able to deal with twice as many transactions. And basically the intuition behind that is we can't really have blocks that are twice as big all of the time because the network wouldn't support it. And because of the speed at which we can raise this base fee on the network, it means we'll only deal with twice full blocks for very short periods of time. So basically the base fee can increase by 12.5% every block. So that means that in roughly 20 blocks or 5 minutes, the gas prices on the networks are up 10x. In 40 blocks or 10 minutes, they're up 100x, and in 60 blocks, they're up 1,000x. And to give you a rough idea, in the entire history of Ethereum, we've seen gas prices basically vary by about a factor of 1,000x. So that means that in 15 minutes, we're able to accommodate kind of as much demand change as we've seen in all of Ethereum's history. So it means we won't be to a spot where we get massive amounts of full blocks on the network. And obviously, what happens is once this base fee is high enough, then users stop being willing to pay it. So the blocks stop being full. And so the base fee converges again to the point where blocks are only 50% full. Second big part of 1559 is this concept of a fee cap and a tip, which is now called a priority fee. So if you see any kind of old stuff about 1559, the reference is a tip. The new term is priority fee, but they're basically the same thing. So 1559 changes how users specify the amount they're willing to pay for transactions. So not only do we have this base fee that's part of the block header, but when you send a transaction, instead of having just the gas price, you're going to have two fields in your transaction. The fee cap and the priority fee. And the fee cap represents the maximum you're willing to pay for a transaction, while the priority fee represents the part of your transaction that will go, transaction fee that will go to a miner. And for a transaction to be valid, basically your fee cap needs to be larger than the sum of the base fee and your priority fee. So that means the amount that gets burnt and that goes to the miner. And what the fee cap allows you to do is that it provides some flexibility for users in case the base fee changes, right? Like we said, it can go up 12.5% from one block to the next. So if you put like a hard-coded price that was just at where the base fee is, and then the next block is higher, then your transaction can't get included. So what we do instead is we tell users that just specify the maximum you're willing to pay, and you'll get refunded the difference. So if you put a fee cap, that's quite high. Once you've paid the base fee and your priority fee to the miners, the difference gets refunded back to you as a user. So to put numbers on this, imagine the network base fee is 100 gwei, you put a priority fee of 5 gwei and your fee cap at 250 gwei. That means that your fee cap is 250, but what you really pay is 105. So 100 for the base fee, 5 to the miner, and the 145 gwei would just be refunded back to your address. And so this allows you to just really specify kind of the maximum you're willing to pay and not worry about overpaying because you're gonna get back the difference. And obviously, the reason why we can't just have the fee cap the fee cap is we want to specify exactly how much is going to go to the miner, and to keep this priority fee as an incentive for them to process transactions. Because if miners were to receive no transaction fees at all, then they would just mine empty blocks and not include any transactions. So we need to give them something that pays for their basically their cost of processing the transactions and the increased risk that their blocks will be uncalled because it has more transactions in them. So to summarize all this, basically what 1559 changes, in the block header, we're adding this base fee field. And then in the transaction format for 1559 transactions, there will be no gas price field, and we'll have a fee cap and a priority fee instead. And one really cool thing about 1559 is we managed to make it backwards compatible. So when obviously, because this changes the way transactions are sent, every single wallet needs to update. But if for some reason the user's using a wallet that did not update, they can still send a legacy transaction on the network, and we'll simply interpret it by setting their fee cap equal to their gas price equal to their priority fee, which means that the biggest difference is that the user will not get a refund back for like the excess amount that they put in their fee cap, like with a native 1559 transaction, but it still means that every single wallet or even previously signed transactions will still be valid on the network. And this is really good news. Okay, last part. So basically fee burning. So one of the, I guess the main intuition behind why we burn the fee is that if we were not to burn the base fee part of the transaction, miners would have a really high incentive to just collude and keep the base fee high. And what this would look like is they could just add a bunch of transactions in the block that send funds back to themselves. And because they're getting all the transaction fees anyway, they would raise this base fee for everybody else in the network. So by burning the base fee, you've removed that incentive for miners to basically stuff the block with their own transactions and raise the fee for everybody else. It's worth noting that miners will still get both the priority fee and the block reward, and any kind of additional rewards from things like MEV. And historically, and especially when this EIP was written, fees had been significantly smaller than block rewards. But over the past year or so, we've really seen this change. So, in the last summer, during DeFi summer, which is right before I originally did this presentation, we actually had days where fees eclipsed the block rewards for consistently for the first time on the network. So the conditions have kind of changed since the EIP was originally introduced, but at a high level, it's still necessary to burn the base fee, and it's worth highlighting that miners will still get the priority fee, the block reward, and any other rewards from things like MEV. And that, like I mentioned at the beginning, burning this base fee also creates this kind of secondary effect where the more people want to use Ethereum, the higher the base fee goes, and that means that the higher the percentage of the supply that gets burnt every time a transaction is paid. And yeah, two things that I wanted to hit on that people often get wrong about 1559 are first that it's going to lower gas prices. So this is really only partially true. So it won't lower gas prices by an order of magnitude, but one thing that it will do is make gas prices within a single block more consistent. So help everybody who's getting included at the same time kind of pay similar amounts, aside from people who have these very high value transactions that submit MEV bundles and stuff like that. But if you're just submitting your regular transaction in a block, it'll reduce kind of the variance with regards to how much you will be paid. And that will provide you some, slight gas savings, but not, massive ones. And it's just worth noting that the gas price is a function of supply and demand. So if there's more people that want to use Ethereum than there is block space on it, then obviously that will lead to gas prices rising. And then the other misconception that comes up a lot is that 1559 will make ETH deflationary. And what's worth noting there is this is only true if the base fee consistently exceeds the block rewards. So until recently, that was not the case. And it's worth noting that any part of the priority fee doesn't doesn't contribute to supply reduction, right? It still goes to miners. So if you want kind of to see a deflationary period, you really have to have a base fee go higher than the total issuance on the network. Then my last slide here before I hand it over to Barnabe, deployment timeline. So people are very curious about that. 1559 is part of the London network upgrade. So just last week, we agreed to the following schedule for testnets for London. So June 24th, we'll see it go live on Robston. Then a week after that on June 30th on Gorley, and a week after that again on Rinkeby. And then once we see the testnets work successfully, we'll then set a mainnet block. Because this is such a massive change, client developers wanted to feel a bit more confident of seeing it live on the testnet before we go ahead and schedule mainnet. Assuming we find no issues on the testnet, I suspect we'll probably have a mainnet block somewhere late July, mid-August. But yeah, this will be confirmed in the next couple of weeks. And that's all I had. Barnabe, you want to take it from here?
So let me share the screen. All right. So yeah, thanks, Tim. Great presentation. So this is kind of a few things that I'll be looking out for when EIP-1559 launches. So it's been, as Tim mentioned, long in the work, and we have, I think, a very good theoretical idea of how we want the mechanism to behave. But obviously, there's going to be a lot of data that we'll receive that will be very important to even fine-tune the mechanism as it goes on. So I just want to discuss a bit about this. All right, so the first point is, so currently how price estimation is done is users typically use oracles, which are maybe embedded in their wallets. And oracles kind of try and tell you what you should be paying for to be included. But current oracles are very sophisticated. They don't rely on any kind of objective measure. They have to rely on what users have been bidding, maybe monitoring transactions and see if they get included at a certain price point. And this is a bit brittle, and as we've seen, we can easily get into situations where you get spikes and users tend to overpay because you just want to make sure that your transaction is going through, and you want to make sure that you don't have to resubmit. So you're kind of trying to lowball so that you don't pay too much, but you also don't want to lowball too much. It's a bit of a mess. So EIP-1559 definitely should make things a lot easier. And I think the great thing that we're getting from this is we have the opportunity to rebuild these oracles really from scratch, and to rebuild them from the perspective that we now have access to this much more objective measure of congestion, which is the level of the base fee and the gas that is used. So namely, if we see that blocks are very full, we know that this is maybe a moment that users should change their bidding pattern. But if we observe that blocks, they're not full, like they're below the block limit, we know that we can just by default give this kind of default strategy to the user, and it's good enough, and it should get them included with much higher certainty than they would have been under the current paradigm. And so most of the time, we don't actually need much input to make this estimation apart from the base fee. Even then, so the current thinking now is to have in the client, so GEF and other clients, we'll have access to the base fee, we'll have access to a few more data points, such as the priority fees that users have been paying. But regardless, this is still a very different beast than it was in the current system. And so I'll definitely be keeping a look at how these new oracles function, and if there's any improvement that we can do there. So the second thing I'll be really looking out for, so we know that there's a regime where EIP-1559 kind of breaks down. It's not such a severe breakdown, it still works, but I'm plotting here on the right what we call the demand curve. So you can think of users, you order them by how much they are willing to pay. So you put the most willing to pay users to the left. And so we know that depending on where the base fee is, so let's say this is a good base fee. So if the base fee currently is 50 GUI, we know that we're targeting like the right amount of users in our demand curve. We know that only these 15 million gas will be willing to pay at least that price. And this is exactly where we are targeting our block. But let's say that base fee is too low for some reason, like a lot of new users have come in the system, and the base fee that we have, maybe let's say 20 GUI, is too low, then we kind of have a problem where the block suddenly is too full. So we're going to be leaving users behind, even though we have this block slack that allows blocks to go above 30 million. And when we're in that case, there is some weak incentive for users to kind of change their behavior and to maybe want to tinker a bit more with the parameters of their transactions. They don't have to do it. They could simply still use the default strategy. It's still a good option. But we know that, okay, this is a case where it's a bit more tangent. We do believe that this case is quite infrequent, in particular because we have this block slack, which most of the time dampens the effect of huge demand shifts. But it'd be kind of interesting to compute just, well, how infrequent is it? So with the meme was kind of, okay, 5% of the time. I actually believe it might be less than this, but we don't really know. And this will be very interesting to kind of get the data on this once 1559 has been launched. So another thing about the base fee dynamics, which really ties with the previous point, in terms of the base fee, we're kind of caught between two options. So we have a trade-off to make. So I said that sometimes the base fee is too low. And when it's too low, it's because it hasn't really caught up with the state of the market. If we make base fee update too quickly, well, sometimes we're overshooting, and then the market is actually not very stable, and we can get into this regime of oscillation, which I'll discuss a bit more in the next slide. But on the other hand, if base fee updates too slowly, then we get like this not great estimation as well, which is laggy. So it's always like constantly trying to catch up with the market. And it means that we should theoretically more often be in that state where there's actually more users which are includable, and the block limit would be overtaken. So we have this trade-off. Currently, we've kind of set this constant. I think it was there in the first specs, and we said, okay, that looks good. You know, it takes 6 blocks for base fee to double. That seems reasonable. Like we don't often see prices going from 50 to 100 GUI within, let's say, the span of 6 blocks. But you know, we could also check the data on this and see, well, is there a way that we can tune this? Do we need to tune it at all? Yeah, that would be interesting. And speaking a bit about the oscillation, and I'm really shilling my work here, there's this weird regime that can sometimes happen where blocks alternate between being empty and being full. And it kind of happens when the demand is particularly concentrated. And then base fee, if it shoots a little bit up, everybody is priced out and the block is empty. And so then when it comes back down, suddenly there's a lot of people waiting to get in, and it goes back up. And it keeps doing like this flip-flopping. It's very pathological. We don't really believe that, okay, we'll observe that a lot in practice, but you know, I'll be looking out to see if it does happen. And if you're interested, there's the link to the paper here. And finally, there's also like some other things. So there's been like other designs. We could tune the current design, which is based on this multiplicative update rule. But we could actually also consider different update rules that are maybe a bit more intelligent or a bit more fine-tuned to the data that we get. One of them is actually Vitalik's ID, and you can find it on ETH Research. It's a way to update the base fee and to think of a gas market as almost like one of these automated market makers. So kind of think of it like Uniswap. And in this paradigm, you think of a block producer, so the miner, as someone who needs to buy gas from the protocol. So the protocol has this supply of gas, and every time there's a new block, this quota kind of goes up, let's say by 15 million. And so the block is willing to sell that gas to the miner. But if the miner wants to buy too much gas, so if there's too many transactions to include in the block, then the price start to rise, which is kind of what we see here. So you have like this invariant, so this curve that gives you the pricing that the miner should pay, and then the miner tries to recoup this cost from the transaction fees of the user. So it's a bit of a different paradigm. It might actually smooth these oscillations that I've presented before. We've done like a couple of initial simulations on this, but it's an interesting, let's say, idea that we could pursue in the future to improve EIP-1559 or to maybe fine-tune it a bit further. Right, and last slide. So another thing that I've been working on for the last year is a fee market simulation library with which we've tried to analyze, let's say, different scenarios for 1559. So the scenario where the blocks are full, what happens when we are moving from this legacy system to 1559? How should we think about the transition? We've also explored things such as the proposal to combine the escalator mechanism, which is a separate fee market mechanism, and 1559 together. You can find all of this. We have notebooks which are open, so you can reproduce the code and run it yourself. It's available at this link. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim and Barnabe. I believe we have some questions.
Oh yeah, there are loads.
Let's do it.
I can start with sort of user perspective questions that you haven't covered already. First of those is around making this more easy to use for users. How are the user interface implementations coming along, i.e. Metamask, the wallets? How's the work progressing for them to accommodate the base fee, max, and priority fee?
So I can maybe chat about that. Basically, we've had a lot of calls with wallets right now. I think wallets are obviously very mindful of trying to provide like the best experience for their users, but it is like a large change, and I think they're trying to find what's the best way to gradually roll this out. And what makes this hard is like, I think once 1559 is fully rolled out and it's kind of stable on the network, we might have another pass at redesigning wallets that is kind of more 1559 native. But now, I think a lot of the wallet designs and a lot of the kind of updates we're seeing are really trying to support both and to kind of focus on this transition for users. And this, kind of concrete examples of that is, figuring out what do you set as a priority fee? Should the wallet just abstract all that in the back, or should we let the users set it themselves? And what's like the right amount to set on the network? So I think, wallets are definitely thinking through it with the goal of providing the best user experience. But I feel like there will be a transition period where maybe it's not like 100% optimal. One thing we've been trying to do on the client side is just provide more data to the wallet. So, what I was working on right before we got here is there's a new JSON RPC endpoint that we're working out called fee history, which instead of providing kind of a gas price for wallets to use, it'll just provide an overview of how the fees were in the last couple blocks. And so wallets can kind of use that to create their own estimations for users. So I suspect that, once 1559 is rolled out, we'll see wallets start to experiment more and come up with better designs that are kind of 1559 native. But I wouldn't be surprised if it takes, a few weeks to a few months for that to happen, just because, it's a hard transition to manage.
To expand on that a little bit, a while back, Coinbase Wallet, which was a pretty popular wallet, did not allow users to adjust their gas prices. And during the happy path for those users, this is great because they were just told this is how much your transaction would cost. You click confirm, that's it. There was no configuration. It was very simple. Unfortunately, when there was high congestion, Coinbase Wallet users would suffer greatly because during high congestion, the users had no recourse. There was no, particularly times of rapid increase in congestion where the Coinbase Oracle, like the gas price Oracle, failed. And again, it's not Coinbase's fault. Every gas Oracle fails at some point in time just due to the way the system has historically worked. And so eventually Coinbase added in the ability for users to set gas prices. This added complexity to their wallet. So previously they had a nice simple wallet. Now they have a more complex wallet that's harder to use. And they do a good job of trying to hide that to users. But ultimately users eventually will have to use that feature if they use Ethereum long enough. With 1559, I believe that Coinbase and other wallets will be able to go back to that model where they just tell the user, hey, this is what this will cost you. We'll deal with figuring out how to get your transaction included, and we'll have a success rate that's some number of nines, like 99.9% of transactions succeed, rather than previously, where it was like 95%, which is a much lower success rate. And so I do think that for end users, and that this is the number one reason why I'm a big fan of EIP-1559 is because of the user experience improvement. Like, it will make it so users don't need to worry so much about fees. They'll just get quoted by their wallet, and that's it. More advanced users can do more advanced things, but the complexity is just so far down that even me, like, I understand gas prices better than probably most people in Ethereum or who use Ethereum. And I still would just simply bid what I'm willing to pay, and that's it. Like, it's a very simple process. Even for someone who knows all these things and could do some more advanced strategy, the strategy I'll probably use is going to be incredibly simple. And so I really think this can translate to users. Like Tim said, though, it'll take time. Wallets like Metagas, for example, like a large portion of their wallet is dedicated to gas pricing. Like, a lot of their UI and UI real estate is just gas pricing. And so it'll take time for them to get away from that. Also, it can be challenging for wallets like Metamask who are trying to support multiple blockchains, because Ethereum switched to 1559, but I don't know if BSC or Polygon, or all these other things that also use Metamask as a wallet have switched yet. And so, or maybe they won't switch ever, I don't know. And so they're in a little tighter spot and it'll be harder for them. I do think eventually, though, they will eventually transition to, like Tim said, 1559 wallet, at which point my hope and my dream is that users can just forget about gas pricing.
So maybe while we're talking about the transition period that came up a couple of times here. So Tim, I think you touched on this before, but I wanted to kind of dive into it overtly. There's been some attention drawn to the fact that Trezor, for instance, does not have a 1559 implementation. There's been a volunteer that is pushed, but it still hasn't been reviewed. I just checked again. Some wallets will not be ready for 1559. What's going to happen for users then, especially in the beginning, if they're using a non-1559 ready wallet?
Yeah, I mean, that's totally fine. So they'll probably overpay slightly with regards to gas. And that's kind of the incentive that's there for wallets to adopt 1559, is it'll enable them to lower the gas prices for their users. But everything will work. So, there's no functionality that will be broken.
Yeah, and they will, to clarify a little bit, that they will overpay exactly how much they overpay right now. So they can, so like right now, everybody overpays a little bit. It's very rare that you pay exactly the minimum amount of gas price that you could. Like, the only people that succeed at that are basically bots who have, great insight into the system. And so right now, everybody overpays. With 1559, if you submit a 1559 transaction, you will no longer be in the class of users that is overpaying. You will now be in the class of users that are paying exactly what you need to pay and no more. People who don't switch over to 1559 will just continue to overpay like they do today.
Great.
Another thing is, as more and more users are using 1559, like as Tim was saying, the prices that we observe in the block, they will tend to vary a lot less. So there will be less of these users overpaying. So you might even see kind of ripple effects where people who are using these legacy wallets, they actually start overpaying a little less as there are more and more people using the 1559 system. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
Do we envisage any changes or sort of process-wise, I mean, as a result of layer 2s being adopted, or is that understood?
What do you mean?
I guess as more users and layer 2 solutions come online, the way those layer 2 solutions treat interactions with the layer 1 will vary. Is the assumption that 1559 will simply handle everything?
So 1559 will improve does have some side benefits for layer 2 solutions, particularly optimistic rollups and the way they do the fraud proofs or fraud challenges, whatever they're called. It's currently complicated for layer 2 solutions, and you need to have a very long timeout window because you need to make sure that the people who are doing the fraud proofs are being compensated enough to offset the gas costs of those fraud proofs. So if a fraud proof takes 5 million gas, as an example, and the gas price is 100 nanoETH per gas, that costs 10 times as much as if the gas price is 10, right? And so the fraud proof or the system needs to pay the fraud prover enough to make sure that they're at least covering the gas costs. Now, one option is just say, okay, well, let's make sure you always pay them way more than enough. So pay them, 1,000. We haven't hit 1,000 before, and so maybe that'll be fine. But now the system is potentially overpaying fraud proofers significantly. Similarly, if we set it too low, you can end up in a situation where if there's Ethereum usage is just really high for a long period of time, it's not profitable to actually submit a fraud proof for the entire duration of the fraud proof opportunity, which is, different systems set it for different durations, sometimes an hour, sometimes a week. And so what you have to do to deal with that is basically extend the fraud proof duration, which extends the withdrawal duration from your layer 2 solution. With 1559, the base fee is well known on chain. And so your fraud proof contract on layer 1 can know exactly what the base fee is. And because it knows what the base fee is, it knows basically exactly how much it needs to compensate the fraud prover in order to make sure that they have a financial incentive to actually submit the fraud proof. And so this allows, hopefully, layer 2 solutions who leverage this knowledge, this base fee knowledge, to set their fraud proof windows to be much smaller. And so instead of having to wait a week because you're like, well, we got to make sure that the gas prices drop low enough, and hopefully within a week they will. Now you can just say, okay, we're going to pay the fraud prover base fee plus 10% or whatever. And that way you're kind of always guaranteed, more or less, that someone will be able to afford to submit a fraud proof, and therefore you can shrink your fraud proof window down. And if you shrink your fraud proof window down, then it means that the withdraw time goes down as well, which improves the usability of layer 2 solutions significantly, because a 1 hour fraud proof window is way better than a 1 week fraud proof window.
Even beyond the fraud proofs, so rollups have to publish data on L1. So they publish this compressed transaction call data. And if they want to pass that cost on to the users, or to make the users pay like a fair cost for the resources that the rollup has to pay for, they can use the base fee as a measure of how costly it is for the rollup to publish that transaction data beyond the fraud proof alone. And I'll point as well that Arbitrum is actually using a mechanism which is a bit similar to 1559 on their layer 2, which is to regulate the congestion on their own system. It's a bit different in the actual implementation, but it's very much this idea of dynamically pricing if there are too many users on the rollup at some point. So, yeah.
Okay. We had lots of questions from the community around base fee burn. Are there any analyses or resources or modeling such that are published that would show what we would expect that to be?
Yes,
we can speculate.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, I mean, there's a lot of analyses. They all vary greatly. I'd say most of the ones I've read vary between 25% to 75% of transaction fees, being burnt. If you want to take the middle, that's like half. The hard part with that is knowing how much of the current gas price would correspond to the priority fee and how much would correspond to the base fee. We just don't know that. We'll see when the network goes live, but I haven't seen an estimate that's less than 25% or more than 75% of transaction fees being burnt.
Something to keep in mind with these estimates is they are very much a function of demand for block space on Ethereum. And so if you look at an estimate that was authored, I don't know, three or 4 months ago, it would have assumed, 200 nanoETH per gas as the kind of the burn rate, which is much different than it is today. Like, and I haven't actually checked today, but like a few days ago it was, 10. And so that's an order of magnitude of 20x. And so you can, just depending on when you did your estimate and what gas price you assumed for your estimate, that's a 20x difference. And so anyone who claims to know the burn rate either can see the future and can know exactly how much block space demand there will be for Ethereum in the future, or they're just making stuff up.
Okay, cool.
That being said, just I don't end too negative there. That being said, we can, if you give an estimate of the base fee, it is very easy to calculate. Like if you give an estimated average base fee over some period of time, it is very easy to calculate how much ETH is burned. And if that average, I think someone ran numbers, double check me on this, but I think it comes out to like around 135 nano ETH per gas. If that's the average gas price over, let's say, a year, then I believe under proof of work will be net neutral. Like there will be no inflation, no deflation. Once we move to proof of stake, because the mint rate is much lower in proof of stake, I think that drops down to about 10. So if the gas price is 10 for a whole year, then again, we're net neutral. If it's higher than 10, we are deflationary. If it's lower than 10, then we're inflationary. And again, this all, whether we will be above or below 135 or 10 depends entirely on future Ethereum demand, and we don't know what that is.
Okay, the next question that we got from several people was, what are the changes specifically for miners, and what is the likely impact on miner revenue until proof of stake?
So again, hard to predict for miners. I mean, there's no real change except upgrading like they do for every hard fork. And this estimate of 25 to 75% of transaction fees that are burned is basically what's removed from miners. It's worth noting the block reward will be unchanged. And the two other things that affect miners kind of much more than 1559 are the ETH USD price. So like that has a lot of volatility in it as well. And the hash rate. So how many other people are mining. And 1559 does nothing about those two things.
As far as what miners will have to do or change, the only thing miners should have to do is tell their clients what the minimum priority fee required for their client to be willing to include a transaction. So when a transaction shows up at the miner can decide to either include it or not include it. For an extreme example, obviously the miner would not include any transaction that pays no priority fee. So the priority fee is set to 0. There is negative incentive for the miner to include that because it increases their uncle rate, which means there's a chance they'll miss out on the block reward by including that. And they gain nothing other than perhaps some karma or something, but they don't get any financial rewards for it. At the other extreme, if someone is paying like 100 ETH per gas, then yeah, the miner is going to include that basically no matter what. Somewhere in between those two numbers is a number where it is the opportunity cost of uncle chances is worth including the transaction. That's estimated to be around 1 or 2 nano ETH per gas. And that's calculating that is much more complex. Like most of the things simplify. That is a very complicated thing. We've known how to calculate that for a long time, but it is complicated. Also, it gets more complicated because as the revenue from other fees in the block increase, so as the block gets bigger, that number actually needs to go up because the chance of getting uncled, when you get uncled, you lose all the transaction fees from the block. And so as your chances of uncling go up, as the block gets more and more full, the opportunity cost of more transactions within that block also goes up. And so there is a kind of more extreme strategy there where you don't want to just naively hard code it to 1 or 2 or something. You maybe want to have it dynamic based on the block fullness. And so if the block is empty, then 1 is the right number. Whereas if the block is full of very high paying transactions, maybe that goes up to 5 or 6 or something like that. I don't know if any clients will launch London with that implemented, with the more advanced strategy implemented. I think they'll all launch, someone correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe they're all going to launch with just the ability for a miner to set a hard-coded value. And again, my recommendation to miners is set it to around the opportunity cost, which is like 1 or 2. Like if you don't want to do any calculations and you prefer having a steady revenue, then 2 is maybe the right number there. If you want to be a little more aggressive and you think fees are generally going to be low, then setting to 1 will mean you're going to include more transactions, and therefore you might actually make more money that way. But it's a little riskier because your uncle rate may go up, noticeably.
In terms of miner revenue in the short term, though, so that goes under the same category that you were saying before. It's difficult to predict.
Yeah, so what's going to most likely will happen here. So if you ask this question when the gas prices were around 200, During those times, miners were making more from transaction fees than they were from the block reward. And so if the base fee is 199 and the priority fee is 1, that means 199 of that 200 is being burnt. And so a significant portion of miner revenue would go away in that scenario. Today, with gas prices being 10 to 15, and if miners' priority fee is 1, that's most of the miners' revenue is coming from the block reward. And so the kind of net percentage change for miners from today to 1559 is much smaller. And so that's why it's hard to predict, because we don't know what the base fee is going to be, because we don't know what demand for Ethereum is going to be like. And so we don't know what percentage of the block reward is going to switch over. We don't know what percentage of miner revenue will be in fees the day before London launches. And so that's kind of like what you'd want to gauge it on. But again, maybe in reality, the day after London launches, gas prices go down because they're volatile and they go up and down all the time. And so it's really hard to say. Like, it really depends on what your premises are and what you're assuming future congestion is going to be like, and a bunch of other factors.
Thanks.
With respect to miners, in terms of consensus for London, where do we sit with that? I'm just conscious of the community activity, calls. A lot of that has been happening over the past 6 months. Where do we sit in regards miner consensus? Do we have it? Do we even need it for London?
I mean, miners are free to do whatever they want, like anybody else on Ethereum. If it seems like there's an extremely strong, if not like unanimous consensus that like applications and developers and whatnot want the London upgrade. If miners want to provide kind of their services to the people who want that upgrade, they're free to. If they want to stop mining at London because it's not profitable for them, they're also free to do that. I'm personally not aware of any kind of group of miners or users or whatnot that want to kind of fork or not fork basically when London arrives. But if part of the community wants to do that and start their own fork, like that's their right to. I'm just not aware of one that's like planned or that has any kind of significant support right now.
And something to keep in mind is that every time there's a hard fork, there are one or more miners who stay behind, almost always on accident, like they just forget to upgrade or something like that. And so if what London launches and people start tweeting, "Oh my God, someone's mining the fork," do not be surprised by that. Just give you a heads up. That happens every single hard fork. It is normal. Some miners just forget to upgrade. Now, if that other fork receives like a 95% hash power, that's interesting. Like, that's new and different. But if just there's some people mining, the mining without London changes, again, that's totally normal. Don't flip out. The world's not ending. There is not a contentious hard fork or anything like that.
I guess maybe as a follow-up for that, like, Barnabe, you were going to say something?
No, I just wanted to point out that the prices of ETH have been really high recently. Also, transaction fees, miners have been extracting MEV, so the hash rate has kind of increased quite a bit in recent times. But hash rate is definitely like stickier and a bit more laggy. So we know that there's an equilibrium where miners are kind of incentivized to mine. So to what Tim was saying, I don't actually expect miners would turn off their rigs as much as new miners might not want to join the system at this point, especially given that proof of stake is coming fairly soon. So,
yeah, you actually touched on MEV, which is the point I wanted to look at. There's been, I guess, an MEV renaissance since the beginning of the year. I mean, at this point, we're looking at Flashbot's adoption being over 80% of hash power. In thinking about the effects of 1559 and miner incentives and all of that, is there a clear way that MEV plays into that as a revenue stream for the miners? Is that expected to maybe increase or decrease or anything of that particular angle, or is that also in the category of unknowns?
I wouldn't expect it to, at 1559 or London, to impact MEV much, really. London also contains another change unrelated to 1559, which is to break or remove gas refunds, that may have a slight impact because the people who leverage that the most tend to be bots, and bots tend to be the ones that are extracting this MEV, because you can just, it's a minor optimization that regular users will almost never do, but bot authors will. So in London, we might see a little bit of stuff happen. I can't say what, but there will be some shifts around. I don't think 1559 though is going to have a significant impact on MEV. Interestingly, like I mentioned earlier, the people who are the best at predicting gas prices are bot authors, and so they will likely be the last ones to move over to 1559. Like, they benefit the least because they are like the people who are doing this sort of MEV extraction are the experts in gas pricing, and they know exactly what to do, and like they don't really get a big advantage. Like, they were already pricing things very precisely, and now they're 1559 doesn't really help them. It's more helps regular people.
Yes, one change with respect to 1559 is that currently you can maybe trade directly with the miner and get included at a 0 fee gas price. Now you still have to pay at least the base fee to get included.
Right.
Very often it's very, I mean, it's residual compared to how much you're paying anyways to get this bundle included. But there's still this thing which I think is really the major change with respect to MEV and 1559.
Yeah, that's a very good point that I forgot. And so yeah, the reason this won't affect the amount of MEV extracted, I don't think. However, it will change the way the bots have to work, because currently bots don't actually have to hold ETH. Like, they can just, there are certain strategies where you actually flash loan everything you need, and so you actually need 0 ETH in the account. So you can run a bot strategy with an account that is completely pristine, like has never touched anything on Ethereum before. Now you will need to acquire some seed ETH somehow in order to do any sort of bot work. What we might see is right after London, like the days after, we might actually see a decrease in extracted value just because a handful of the bots will break because they didn't pay attention, they didn't upgrade. Just like what mentioned earlier, some miners just don't upgrade their software. There will probably be some bots who don't upgrade their software. And so you might actually see a small decrease in extracted value around London, just again, as a side effect of people not updating. But long term, I don't think it'll have a big impact.
And I have some potential MEV alpha for those listening. I think one thing that's worth considering post 1559 is the transaction pool will be segregated much more cleanly between transactions that can and cannot be included. So right now, the transaction pool is just this bunch of transactions, all of which could be included, and there's thousands of them. So it can be hard to like reason and run computations on them all. Once 1559 goes live, you'll have like a certain base fee, and you can predict kind of the range of where that base fee will be, like 1 block, maybe 2 blocks out. So being able to have like a much smarter set of transactions on which you can, which you can potentially consider for inclusion in the next block or two, might lead to some different like multi-block MEV strategies, where if you have good odds of like mining 2 blocks in a row through your pool, there might be some things you can do with transactions that are like not valid now, but that that with the next base fee would be valid, and stuff like that. So I suspect, and this will be probably even more true in EIP-2, when the block time is fixed and when the validator set is fixed, where if you have like a large pool or something like that, they can know for sure that they will be producing 2 blocks in a row. So I suspect that's like something that we won't see at the get-go, but where it will come up over time. So multi-block MEV is going to be interesting to follow.
Very interesting.
Okay, I know that we are hitting time, so last question from me. There will be a massive amount of interest in following this go live for London. So Tim, I guess, is there a detailed deployment plan that people can follow, or other tools, and where can it be followed on the day?
I mean, so there's a plan. I kind of shared the deployment, the mainnet. every tool that has their own roadmap. Like I suspect the major tools will want to support this before mainnet. So, we've talked it out with Infura, we've talked it out with Metamask. Coinbase has been pretty engaged in those conversations as well. There's a bunch of other ones I'm forgetting. So not just those three. All of the kind of dev libraries, so Ethers, Web3.js, and whatnot, are also following this closely. So, we're going to have the first testnet fork next week. We're going to have more testnet forks kind of the couple weeks over that. And, I suspect more and more tooling will get ready during that time. And again, if, a tool is not ready for mainnet, it's not necessarily the end of the world. They can support 1559 afterwards, and that's totally fine.
Okay, awesome. Pooj has given me the rope to ask more questions. Is that right, Pooja?
So yeah, I was just making sure that if there are any more questions, Shane, you want to go ahead with a couple of more questions? I think we have 10, 15 minutes on tap.
Oh, okay, sure. The most upvoted question that I haven't asked yet was from Reddit user Impastable. It's quite a long one, so I'll read it verbatim, and then guests can chime in. So the question is, on the assumption that with increased market congestion, miners are free to exceed the target gas limit to fit more transactions, which drives the base fee up for future blocks. No doubt this will happen during periods of high activity. Would the reverse ever happen? Is there any expectation that miners will ever drop under the target block size, therefore reducing the fee target for the next block?
I can take this one. I mean, mathematically, you have to counterbalance high base fees with low base fees. So on average, blocks will be at the target, so 15 million. But it cannot be that base fee just keeps, you cannot always be above the target, otherwise base fee just goes to infinity. So at some point, since base fee is really like a binding fee, like it's the minimum that users have to pay, if it's too high, it has to come down. So there are moments, of course, when congestion kind of decrease, where base fee needs to drop because there's just not enough users who are willing to pay the base fee to be included, and then the base fee will naturally drop.
Okay. So I can deduce kind of what I suspect the person's actually trying to ask, which is there's a lot of worry about miners attacking the system and manipulating things by either including their own transactions or excluding transactions they could otherwise or would be profitable to include. For the miners including their own transactions, that one's easy. It's just prohibitively expensive for miners to do that attack. Like they will just eventually run out of money doing that. For the inverse, miners excluding transactions, this one's also, it's not a profitable strategy long-term, and it's a little more complicated why that is, but the crux of it is that it isn't, any selfish participant is better off defecting from some sort of colluding group than they are from participating in the collusion. Up to a certain limit where you have a bunch of other attacks. If you have 51% of miners are all colluding in some way, lots of attacks opens up, so we kind of ignore that scenario because it's a known big problem. But for below 50% of miners colluding, it's the optimal strategy for a miner is to tell other miners, yes, I will collude with you, and then proceed to not collude with them, like mine under a different address or something, and basically just lie. And this creates a very difficult scenario to create like a malicious group. Like it's like if you have a bunch of thieves who are all strongly incentivized to tell each other that they'll work together while going and reporting the rest of the group to the cops or whatever it is. Like it just is not a stable equilibrium at all. Like it is always profitable to defect. And so because of this, yes, there are some theoretical attacks where if all the miners got together and they all just 100% said, we are going to mine less than full blocks in order to make sure that there is no base fee and we get it all and everything reverts back to the pre-London system. Basically, everybody's bidding. It's just like if you're a miner and all the miners are doing that, you just immediately say, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then you go, don't do it. And you make twice as much money as everybody else. Like it's just an optimal strategy to not participate. And so because of this, I'm not very worried about miners colluding to attack the system. It's way too complicated for humans to actually pull off at that scale.
Okay. We've got another a longer question up next. Again, I'll read verbatim from the question. It's under the current proposal, the gas fee would go to 0 gwei from 1 gwei since it uses integer division to calculate the next base gas price. Is that true? Assuming it is, after sharding is implemented, is there a chance that gas price can go below 1 gwei to mwei levels? Has that been considered?
Yes, I think the person who authored this might be confused. So Gwei, which I like to call nano ETH because I think it's more clear, is actually 10 to the 9th atto ETH or Wei. So it's actually a very big number. And we don't run into integer division problems until you get down to 1 Wei or atto ETH, which is a very tiny number. And when that happens, it can drop down to 7, and then it can't go lower than 7. And then from 7, it'll go up to 8, and then 8 to 9, et cetera, et cetera. So the integer division problem is basically, when the cost of calculating the division is far more expensive than the difference. Like that's such a tiny number that it is 100% insignificant. You don't need to worry about it. It definitely can go below 1. And I expect there may be times when it does go below 1. That seems very reasonable. Oh, sorry, 1. I say 1 there. I meant 1 nano ETH or Gwei.
Awesome. And then this is my last question. So in terms of stakers on Beacon Chain, anything that they need to do? I presume not. And do we have an understanding of impacts likely for staking rewards?
So this mechanism for fees has always kind of been planned for proof of stake. In fact, if it didn't go in London, it probably would have gone in sometime around the merge or maybe after the merge. There's nothing stakers need to do between now and the merge at all. Like they can just ignore London update, other than need to update your software, and like you do with all hard forks. But you can basically just treat it like you would any other update. After London or after the merge, once like staking is actually doing something meaningful, this will kind of, again, this affects them in the same way it affects miners, in that it affects how the fees they're getting come in, like how much they're getting. But again, that's something they should always have been prepared for, because the proof of stake, proof of stake, this was always the plan.
Yeah, and stakers in ETH2 are part of the consensus layer, and all these changes to the fee market and everything it's part of the execution layer. And the execution layer is just grandfathered into this new consensus layer once you switch on proof of stake and switch off proof of work. So from a staker perspective, like they just replace functionally the role that miners had until now, proposing the blocks and having them included in the chain. So no change for them on that front, apart from upgrading, as Micah says.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Alita, you had some. You want to go ahead with that?
So I have one question. I remember, like, I heard about this previously, but there was like a functionality where you could basically like buy gas at a lower price and then use it later. Is that still being included?
So what we're talking about is gas refunds, basically. That is going away in London, but unrelated to 1559. We're turning off gas refunds in the London hard fork as a separate change to 1559. So it's very easy that a lot of people, I think, get those two confused, where they think, oh, London is just 1559, but it's actually 1559 plus a couple of other minor things. One of those things is the removal of refunds, which means you can no longer pre-buy gas.
Thank you. So yeah, London is coming up with, I guess, 5 proposals in total, and we have a blog on the Ethereum cat herders medium. It's a London blog post for people who would like to prefer text description. It's a good read to have an overview of the proposals that can be expected with the upgrade. And also at the PEEPanEIP playlist, you can find a playlist for London upgrade special. Thank you, Tim, Barnabe, Micah, for joining us, talking about EIP-1559 and the upgrade timelines. Thank you to the Reddit community and all of our Ethereum cat herders to come up with all these questions. I know the community has a lot of interest in this proposal, so they have a lot of questions, but we have hit the time for today's discussion. I hope to have some of the questions answered in this episode. With that being said, I want to thank all of our YouTube viewers for watching this episode and our show. If you care about the Ethereum proposal, do like it and share it with people of similar interest. If you have got any feedback about this proposal, or if you have any questions left, leave a comment for each Ethereum cat holders or the guests. You can also add your comments to the discussion link of proposal 1559 at the Fellowship of Ethereum Magician. One last announcement that is about the users and developers survey. So cat holders are collecting community feedback with users and developers. If you haven't filled up the form yet, the feedback form, consider filling it. It will give us the information that the clients could use to improve the product and the services. All the details with the presentation shared today about the resources will be added in the description box. Next week, we will have another special guest to talk about Beacon Chain Upgrade, Altair. So stay tuned, keep watching, and keep sharing your love with Ethereum cat holders. Have a lot of fun. See you then.